we will hear from Mark Grover, Emeritus BYU Library faculty. Brother Grover was born and raised in Malad, Idaho. He served a mission to Brazil from 1966 to 1968. He has a BA in History and a Master's of Library Information Science from BYU and an MA and PhD from Indiana in Latin American and African history. He recently retired from the library faculty at BYU, where he has worked since 1973. His most recent book is on the church in South America in the 1960s, A Land of Promise and Prophecy, Elder A. Theodore Tuttle in South America, 1960 to 1965. He is finishing a book on the history of the South American Mission, 1925 to 1935. He is married to Ivelisse Morales, and they have 4 children. Dr. Grover. I should have pulled that up for you. There you go.
Thank you. Happy to be here. I'm going to be doing a much more general presentation on just the role of Latin America in the globalization of the church, but I appreciate the more specific discussions over on education in Mexico. If you look at the graphic at the Public Relations Department press page of the LDS Church, you see the message: we are a global church. And if you look at the numbers that are used, 90 languages for conference, 109 languages for the Book of Mormon, you see that general. But if you look at that right up there in terms of the language, what you see really, that a very important element of the globalization of the church is the expansion of the church into Latin America, including the languages being almost equal to English, Spanish, and Portuguese combined. That's not an unusual thing. It's something that's happening all over in Christianity in general, and that is a movement of the Christianity to the south. This was brought up in Philip Jenkinson's book on global Christianity, where he stated the following: by 2050, about 1/5 of the world's 3 million Christians will be non-Hispanic whites. The era of Western Christianity has passed within our lifetime, and the day of Southern Christianity is dawning. So what you see is a movement, a changing in Christianity from Western European to Southern in Latin America and in Africa. And Latin America then is what we're going to talk about today. And what I'm going to suggest is that the globalization of the church in many ways is a changing of the church from an American church to an America's church, in which the growth that's occurred has primarily occurred in terms of statistics in Latin America. I'm going to use a secular approach, descriptive and approach, but I want you to realize my strong belief in the role of the divinity in this evolution, although that probably will not come out. In order to understand this, there are 2 items that needs to be talked about that occurred before 1950s, when this expansion began to occur. And that is, the first, the identification of Latin American with the indigenous population. As after the publication of the Book of Mormon, as members began to speculate as to where Lehi landed, it became obvious, primarily after 1840, that it probably occurred in Latin America. And so that for LDS members and for the LDS churches, in many ways, Latin America is identified historically in the church because of the native peoples, and not the European or the African, when in reality, Latin America and the expansion of the church into Latin America has occurred amongst the European and African and mestizo population. But our identification in our minds is that it's an indigenous area. The second is that there's about 100 years of when the church was, quote, going after the tribe of Ephraim. And Joseph Smith never identified the geographic location of Ephraim, although because of kind of these pseudo-scientific theories that were developed in the 19th century, basically to justify the colonizing activities of Great Britain and the rest of Northern European. The geographic identification of the tribe of Ephraim was in Northern Europe by many members of the church, and you hear that, you see that in a lot of the talks of General Conference. Part of that was a negation of any of the tribe of Israel in Southern Europe, so that the expansion of the church, the gathering of Ephraim, was not going to occur in those areas where the Catholic areas of Spain, Portugal, and Italy, but in Northern Europe. So there was an almost ignoring of Latin America beyond small missions in Mexico and Argentina. So those two are important. That changed with President David O. McKay, in which he turned the view of the church away from the United States into the international church. And his focus was not on Latin America. In reality, it was on Europe and Polynesia. But Latin America was a beneficiary of the changes that were going to occur, particularly because of a trip that he took in 1954 throughout all of the world, actually. But in Latin America, when he saw the potential of the church in Latin America, first, number one, and made a commitment that resources of the church would be used in order, particularly, first of all, for the building of chapels. These are the chapels, early chapels, right there. That's the chapel in Araçatuba in Brazil. That's another chapel. In other words, they were rented homes. No money had been expended in order to build what he wanted to do, was to build early chapels. So he began to encourage then and make funds commitments to Latin America. One of the important things that he did was sending of a general authority to live in Latin America, which was A. Theodore Tuttle, on his horse in Uruguay. This is Montevideo. Love that picture. Anyway, what he did in many ways was to travel amongst the missions, and using these mission presence began to expand the church in South America. And his concept was almost an equalization of the church in Latin America as it was in the United States. Support expansion of missionary work, support the expansion of locals in administrative positions, the organization of stakes, which occurred in 61 in Mexico and 66 in Brazil, and then finally the building of temples. In other words, to make it equal. A second thing that happened that was church-wide was, and part of Tuttle's was the expansion of the church into the rest of Latin America. So you see, the periods in which the church expanded. Mexico first, Argentina, and Brazil second. After the war, with Central America primarily. The blue there is what Elder Tuttle did, as he expanded the church into all of the areas of Latin America where they could go, with the exception of the Afro areas of the Caribbean. So the second thing that happened was correlation, and oftentimes correlation is looked as a negative. And by the way, that picture has nothing to do with correlation. But I love the fact that Harold B. Lee, who was the one that was organizing correlation, has the other four apostles singing there. Anyway, the whole function of correlation was to make all programs in the church similar, no matter where they were. And part of that program was to statistically define when things happened in the church. So when a certain number was reached, or a certain number of tithe payers was reached, then an organization occurred, an organization of the state. And what happened is it became international, not only in the United States, so that the church outside of the United States was made equal to, in many ways, to the church in the United States. And part of that was just this, publication and transportation. The one on the right is the first hymnal, and on the left is the first hymnal in Latin America published by the missions, and then you see, the centralization of what's happened right now. So what that is that's a preparation for growth that's going to occur in Latin America, primarily from the 1980s. And the best way to show that is by statistics, although that's not the only way, but if we can show just the amount of growth, this is what we have. In 1978, the church membership worldwide was just over 4 million. In 25 years, that the church in Latin America equaled that growth, that it took the church almost 150 years to have the same level of growth. In 25 years that occurred. From 1978, the church in Latin America went from 12 to 40% of the church in a phenomenal growth. What was happening was that in Latin America, there were economic changes that affected the political and cultural growth of Latin America. Basically, industrialization, growth of the cities, migration from the rural to the urban areas, and as these migrants came into these areas, they were cut off from the kind of the patrimonial structure that had controlled them, and they began looking oftentimes for other religions. And so what you saw then was an expansion of other religions other than the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church went from over 90% in the 1960s to the present time, where it's about 70%. That's an amazing change of religion that was occurring. Most of that growth occurred in the evangelical churches, as you saw smaller churches, as well as these massive churches like the Universal Church in Brazil, which is actually all over. We, as the LDS Church, are a minor part of that expansion. But we were able basically to take advantage of that in some ways because of internal changes that occurred in the church. And the first one is the priesthood revelation of 1978, which really only affected a couple of areas: the Caribbean, Brazil, some areas of Colombia, Venezuela. But there's a psychological change that occurs, and that is that the gospel is now available not only to all races, but to all people. And you have an expansion of a psychological change that occurs in the church. The second thing is the area presidents, and this is an incredibly important thing that occurs in 1984 because it decentralizes decisions that are made administratively, because the area presidencies in all of these areas not only have the ability to make decisions, but they also have the bureaucratic structure of the church to help them. The second thing that occurs is that the local leaders then began to have more of an influence. Not only the Americans, who are oftentimes in the quorum of the 70, but local leaders began to have influence. And there's a significant, interesting significance in terms of how it changes missionary work. Elder Tuttle oftentimes would go into a group of missionaries and he'd say, "I want to baptize a car today." In other words, the concept was that we are looking for somebody who looks like middle-class Utahns. When these local leaders come in, they don't have that concept. And with the change in the priesthood revelation, you begin to see missionary work shift from the middle-class areas more into the lower-class areas, and you just begin to see an expansion then of the church. And this is what happens. You can see just in the numbers that occur, and you can see the points. You can see points right there, you know, of the priesthood revelation and then the area studies. But then you see this just huge expansion of the church up until the present time. The annual growth rates for the church between 80 and 99 was 4.6. In Latin America, it was 10.3. From 2000 to 2013, the percentage growth rate has dropped, but not necessarily the numbers that are going in, which was talked about a little bit earlier. So the three largest countries, or the three most, are Mexico, Brazil, who have now gone over 1 million members, and Chile, which is interesting for other reasons. Those that you can see the numbers. Even though the percentage of growth rate is decreasing, the numbers continue to increase in Mexico and in Brazil. And Chile, though, flattens out a little bit. What you see happening then is this. This is the 10 countries with the largest number of members. 7 of the 10 are from Latin America. The next 10, the 20, it's the same thing. 7 of the 10. So you have the Dominican Republic, for example, in that area with a large growth. It changes the structure. It changes where the church is. Now, so that if you look at the membership right now, it's about 15 million. If you take just the Latin America out of there, It drops down to 8.9 million, or about 9 million. I decided to do a hypothetical, and that is from 1980 to 1913, I decided to take out the Latin American growth and see how fast the church was growing everywhere else. And then to hypothetically decide, what if the church in Latin America had grown at the same rate the church was growing throughout the world? And had that happened, the membership of the church would be 9.8 million, with just a little over 1 million in Latin America. So you can see the importance then of the growth of the church in Latin America on the expansion. So that at the present time, this is basically, what we have, about almost 6 million members in Latin America, almost 1,000 stakes, 148 missions, and 42 temples. Now with that, this is statistical, but with that becomes issues and concerns. And the two that I want to talk about are poverty, retention and poverty. With the fact that Latin America has grown so fast, it becomes in a sense kind of the hero or the explanation for what's happening. It also becomes the goat because of problems and issues that may occur. If you have a retention problem in Belgium and you have a retention problem in Chile, you're going to examine Chile over Belgium just because of the numbers. And so in a sense, that's what Latin America has come to the church. Well, the problem is retention. How many of those that are being baptized actually have to stay in the church? And identify themselves as Mormon. And we don't have the statistics, to do that because the church doesn't allow us to do it. But there are two ways that David Knowlton has looked in order to decide how many of those actual members who are baptized are actually consider themselves members. And that is to look at census of these three countries, because each of these sentences you can identify yourself as to what your religion is, and Mormonism is a box. So in Chile, in the 2002 census, and in Mexico, you have 103,000 who are self-declaring themselves as members, but our statistics say there are 520,000. So only 20% of that number are actually saying themselves on the census that they are members. Two things. There's problems with the census, and that probably isn't as legitimate as we would hope to, but still it indicates, that we do have some, serious issues of retention as shown in these three. The other one is the size of stakes. The larger number you have in a stake is an indication of a higher percentage of inactivity. So in Utah and Idaho, as David shown, the size of the stakes were 3,000 to 3,050, whereas in Latin America, some of the stakes, are up to 7,500. So that is a problem. Retention is a problem, and became an issue and a concern that was expressed by President Gordon B. Hinckley in two different ways. A couple of talks in priesthood in which he seriously talked about that. The first one in 97, where he said, "This loss must stop. It's unnecessary. I'm satisfied the Lord is not pleased with us." And he began to focus on the importance of having the leadership of the church deal with retention issues that were occurring. The second is with the missionary programs, as there began to be a slowing down of the growth rate and more of an emphasis on making sure that members stay active. And this is a quote of when he was in Chile in 1999, where he seriously chastised the Chilean missionaries. And one of the things that he did was to send Elder Holland into Chile for 2 years as the area president. And you see that what Elder Holland did was basically to slow down the growth and to make sure that the units were strong enough so that they could be able to handle the growth. So in 2002 to 2003, the annual growth rate in Chile went from 10% to 0.52%. So he basically shut it down in many ways. And in fact, right now in 2012, the growth rate in Chile is 1.21%, which is the lowest growth rate in Latin America. So that was a problem. The other one was education, and I'm not going to deal with this, but this is a perpetual education fund that was established. Anyway, I'm very positive about the church in Latin America. It's still, there's a changing that's occurring. You know, these three men have been in the presidency of the 70. There have not been a Latin American called in the Council of the 12, which would make them in line for the presidency of the church. Maybe they may be a little afraid because of the example of Pope Francis. I'm not sure, you know, as an Argentine. But I'm very positive of what's in Latin America. Yes, there are problems of retention, poverty, you know, but there's a vibrancy about the membership in general and strong leaders equal to any in the church. We have many who are owners of CEOs. In fact, I think we have our first billionaire in Brazil who's a member of the church. There are numerous examples of young members who have faced social and economic challenges and have impressive stories of success. I also find solace in what is happening in Latin America in general. Regardless of the stories found in the press about Latin America that focus on violence, drugs, the silly and the profane, there's a new sense of confidence in many of the countries. It's led by Brazil and Chile with their impressive economic growth and political maturation. Latin Americans are confident of their lives and look positive towards their future. This growing self-confidence is resulting in a lessening of dependence and control from outside, particularly from the United States. The political systems are functioning and maturing, and the economic challenges are being addressed. These feelings are felt by the members of the church in Latin America as they see themselves as equal to their American brothers and sisters. This confidence will affect the church in Latin America as it continues to grow and expand and become even more important in the church and in general. And I look forward to what the future will bring in Latin America. Thank you.